So copper nickel mining, especially when done in what they call sulfide ores, where there's sulfur mixed with the metal they're trying to mine, when it's mined, it creates a lot of waste rock, and that waste rock contains sulfates, which is a form of sulfur. What we know from research into wild rice is that the sulfates can harm wild rice, and in fact, in waters where there are high levels of sulfate, wild rice can't grow at all. And so before we had a lot of disturbance in the watersheds of Minnesota, wild rice used to grow across our entire state. Now it only grows in relatively small areas, mostly in northern Minnesota, where there's less disturbance in the watersheds where the wild rice can grow. And particularly when it comes to mining, that sulfate contamination, that pollution, is the real issue for the survival of wild rice in northern Minnesota. There are other factors, of course, which affect wild rice and its ability to grow, including water levels and all sorts of other issues. But really, from our perspective, chemically, the pollution created by mining does pose a threat to all the wild rice stands that are downstream of proposed copper nickel mines in northern Minnesota.
I've heard it said that wild rice is the canary in the coal mine for our water purity. And I've heard it said that sulfides mix with mercury in an exceptionally powerful way for uptake in the food chain.
Yeah, so this idea that wild rice is a canary in the coal mine is a good analogy because wild rice as a plant is very sensitive to changes in its environment. Where wild rice thrives is almost always a very pristine and healthy ecosystem. And where wild rice cannot grow is oftentimes a degraded ecosystem. And so because of that, it's a good analogy. To your point about to mercury, there's a complicated relationship between sulfates and mercury. Everyone knows what mercury is in terms of it being an element. It's a metal. But the really harmful form of mercury is what they call methyl mercury. And methyl mercury is a form of mercury that is much more easy for your body to take up and to move into your brain. Everyone might be familiar with the idea of the Minamata disaster in Japan, where a factory released mercury into the surrounding ecosystem and it caused brain damage and neurological disorders for the community nearby. The really important linchpin to that was that the mussels in that case, I think the mollusks, converted this into methyl mercury. When folks ate those mussels, they became ill. Here in northern Minnesota, sulfates play a critical role in what they call the methylation of mercury, converting it from its elemental form into methyl mercury, a form that can enter people's bloodstreams. And so when you eat fish that are contaminated with methyl mercury, it can cause neurological damage for people. Yeah, so there are several copper nickel mine proposals in northern Minnesota. One of them is called Polymet. It's the one that a lot of folks are familiar with because it's the most advanced in its permitting. Polymet is in the Lake Superior watershed, just south of what they call the Laurentian Divide, that divides the surface watershed between the Lake Superior and Rainy River watersheds. Another mine proposal named Twin Metals is just north of that divide and would initially flow into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, but then would eventually exit the wilderness and head along the Rainy River toward Voyageurs National Park and points further north and west, excuse me. And so all the watersheds in northern Minnesota are at risk from copper nickel mining because the proposals to build mines are perched right on top of that Laurentian Divide, flowing both north and south. And so there are several proposals, each of which pose a threat to a specific watershed, but all of them have similar characteristics. They're all tapping into the same ore body and therefore have similar chemical characteristics and pollution risks. And the biggest among those are really the heavy metals and sulfates and potentially acid mine drainage that could result if we don't take care of the waste. And it's very difficult to do that in a water-rich environment. In fact, no mine has ever done that adequately. We know that in nearly all cases, these kinds of sulfur-bearing rock mines, they cause damage and pollution downstream.
So, I don't know if we fully comprehend that the risk to what our environment will look like if there was a massive acid spill out of the retaining ponds could you describe what we could be looking at Rainy Lake, for instance, which is a tourist area?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple of different ways in which copper nickel mining is threatening to the environment and can cause pollution. There's kind of a slow motion, long-term disaster, and then a fast-moving, just catastrophic, well, let me start again.
Okay.
All right. I think a lot of folks don't understand that there are multiple ways in which a copper nickel mine can create pollution that can damage ecosystems. One is a slow motion, long-term unfolding disaster that can take generations to happen and can go on for hundreds of years. The other can be a more spectacular, short-term, and catastrophic failure. I'm going to talk about both of these in turn. First is all of these copper nickel mines in the United States and elsewhere that are in this kind of sulfur-bearing rock create long-term water pollution, both of groundwater and surface water. And the question then is, can you contain it? Can you prevent it from escaping? And in almost all cases, water will win. Water flows downhill. Water flows downstream. And controlling polluted water and keeping it in one spot is virtually impossible. We know that there are Roman mines in Europe, for example, in similar kinds of ore bodies that continue to pollute now thousands of years after they were closed. So there's no reason to believe that that won't happen here. And in fact, the Polymet mine proposal, the study that they did of that found that the pollution could last 200 to 500 years or longer after the mine closes. So there's a long-term, slow-motion disaster that's possible. There's also the possibility of a spectacular, catastrophic disaster, such as what we saw in Mount Poly in British Columbia, more recently in Brazil, and 2 iron mines that collapsed there. This is what happens when you store what they call mine tailings, which are the finely ground up remains of the rock that they take out of the earth after they've processed it for metal. In the case of the Polymet mine, they propose to store that waste behind a 250-foot high earthen dam that would last for forever. In fact, they would be required under their permit to maintain it in perpetuity, which means forever. The Twin Metals mine is still early on in its planning stage. Recently, they claimed that they would use a technique called dry stacking that would be less likely to cause that kind of spectacular disaster. But again, when that mine waste mixes with air and water, it creates pollution, and that pollution flowing downstream can cause damage to ecosystems for decades or even centuries. And once it's in the ecosystem, it's impossible to contain. Once we know from experience that once these mines start polluting, they don't stop. Because the kind of pollution that they create it doesn't come out of a smokestack or a pipe. It's the reaction between air and water and the waste rock left behind. And that reaction keeps going on hundreds of years after the mine closes.
And the volume of the waste rock, I mean, it's not just a room full of rock, is it? We're talking about how much in what they're proposing.
Well, to give you some sense of scale, you oftentimes think about like mining an ore is it's got a vein of metal in it, right? You find the vein of metal, you pull it out, and then you're done with it. In this case, the metal are little tiny flecks that are disseminated throughout the ore body, and the minerals that Twin Metals and Polymet are trying to mine are about 99.5% waste rock. So that means for every ton of metal, you have 199 tons of waste. And so that is the ore that they're trying to get. That doesn't include the waste rock that's left behind that's not rich enough in metal for them to bother processing. And that means that these operations in these very low-grade ore bodies, which is what is up in northern Minnesota for copper and nickel, leave a tremendous amount of waste behind. In the case of Polymet's mine, which is the most advanced and we have the most detailed plans of, they would leave behind not only a 900-acre lake, 250 feet deep in the air behind a dam forever with mine tailings. They would also leave behind a pile of waste rock over a mile long, about a quarter of a mile wide, and 150 feet high at their mine site. And in the case of Twin Metals, not only would they it's an underground mine, they would fill the underground mine works with waste after they were done, but there would be more waste left over that would have to be piled on the surface. And so this would leave behind piles of mine waste at closure. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of waste. which is the nature of these low-grade body or ore bodies. And for that matter, it's part of the reason why they've never been mined before, because they would leave so much waste behind. Well, I don't think it's ever selfish to want to protect your clean water. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that if these mining companies were actually honest and serious about their desire to build a renewable energy economy, they would be joining groups like MCEA at the Capitol and advocating for the policies that will drive us toward a renewable energy economy. In fact, they're doing the exact opposite. They're going to the legislature and telling them they can't afford renewable energy. And in fact, they are trying to argue to preserve the coal plant that would serve the electrical needs of these proposed mines. So the idea that this mining, it is true that copper and nickel are contained in wind turbines and solar panels, but that does not mean that we should mine that everywhere that there is copper and nickel. We can make good choices about where it makes sense for us to mine those minerals. And in this case, it doesn't make sense. This is a water-rich environment that is very difficult to contain pollution, a poor, low-grade ore body, and incredibly valuable downstream aquatic resources that would be put at risk. Whether we're talking about the actual just intrinsic value of a pristine boundary waters, or the value that clean water has to the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, for their ricing and for fishing. Either way, these are resources that are irreplaceable. And the idea that we must mine these minerals wherever they find them and can make a profit, without regard for whether or not it's a safe place or a good plan, is not something that we accept. One other thing that I would add to this is that it's a falsehood that we have stronger or stricter standards for mining here in Minnesota than there is in other parts of the world. For example, at the Polymet mine, the kind of dam construction that they are proposing, what they call upstream dam construction with earth that's basically mine waste itself, has been banned by the country of Brazil and by the country of Chile, both big mining regions, one iron, one copper, because it's unsafe. And here in Minnesota, we're on the brink of permitting and constructing a mine that uses a construction technique that Brazil and Chile have both said is an unsafe way to protect, it's not going to protect downstream waterways and communities. One other thing that's important to keep in mind is that what we've learned now through the Polymet permitting process is that our agencies, unless we hold them accountable directly, are not going to necessarily take actions that protect us and our waterways. What we've learned is that the MPCA worked with the Trump-appointed administrator of the Region 5 Environmental Protection Agency office to suppress their own scientists' and regulators' comments about their concerns about the water permit issued to Polymet. And so in this world where intense political pressure is being brought to bear on the regulators whose job it is to protect our water, we find that all too often the political outcome, the political whims, overwhelm good science, overwhelm facts, and overwhelm the rule of law. And that gives us great concern, and it's part of the reason why we're so worried about not only the Polymet project that is so far advanced in its permitting, but also potential new projects like the Twin Metals project, which threatens the Rainy River watershed. So I think the first thing I would say to someone who wants to know how to get involved is to know that their voice does matter, that you should be calling your representative, you should be showing up to your state representatives' information sessions and raising this issue with them, even if they don't agree with you right now. I think one of the things that's most important for folks to understand is that you're not going to move somebody from one position to another in a single interaction with them, but those things accumulate over time. And so consistently hearing from people that are concerned about the impact that copper nickel sulfide mining would have on their waterways, on the Rainy River, on the whole Rainy River watershed is really important. So people like Representative Rob Eklund, who represents that area, he needs to hear from you. I think that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is that the Twin Metals project appears to be on the verge of submitting their what they call mine plan of operations, which begins the environmental review process for the mine, and it moves them toward permitting. At every stage along that process, there are opportunities for public input. Sometimes those public input opportunities are frustrating because it doesn't seem like the regulators are listening. But I can tell you this much. If you don't participate, they will take your silence as agreement. They will move forward with these projects without your input. And so as we move into a stage where there are more opportunities for the public to file specific comments, to go to public meetings, and to make their voice heard. It is absolutely critical for folks that care about this issue to show up, and to show up in big numbers. One last thing is, you said about being from a small town. To some extent, being in a small community gives you a sense of power that you would otherwise not have in a large city. You have a much more interpersonal relationship with some of these decision makers. You can pick up the phone and call your representative in ways that may be difficult for someone in a large city to do. So take advantage of that. Don't think of yourself as being disadvantaged by being from a small town, but rather think about the power that you have to reach out to people on an interpersonal, one-on-one basis and make your voice heard and make your point of view known to the folks that represent you. Because if you fail to do that, they will write the laws without you, they will write the permits without you, and it will not be for the benefit of you or the water.